back. So is it accountability? The Federal Election Commission is now fining Hilary Clinton and the Democrat National Committee over the way it paid a firm to produce the notorious Steele dossier. The Clinton campaign has been fined $8,000 and the DNC slapped with a $105,000 penalty after a 2016 letter revealed that they violated campaign finance rules. The FEC says both parties failed to properly report payments for opposition research and the production of the dossier, instead labeling the payments legal services. Former President Trump now asking, where do I get my reputation back? Dagan McDowell, I mean, $8,000 fine, really. This is obviously not much in terms of accountability after 4 years of debate in this country, fights, division because of the Steele dossier and the Russia collusion lie.
Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's returning guest is the legendary Scott Horton. He previously came on to speak about Israel, Syria, Bill Hicks, the war on drugs, all the usual type of stuff. He's here today to talk about specifically Russiagate, which I'm sure if you're from the US, you will know. If you're from the UK or Europe, maybe not so much. But Scott has just written a great book that I'm getting through at the moment, as it is a large book, basically about kind of the US provocations with Russia since the end of Cold War, going through the different presidents up to today. He included Donald Trump in that, and a large part of that chapter is about Russiagate. So before we get into that, how are you doing today, Scott?
I'm great. Thanks for having me back.
Perfect. So, as I said, a lot of people may not be familiar with Russiagate outside of the US, or they know it in the US, but they've forgotten about it, or how crazy it was, or the new generation. So first of all, can you just tell people what the official story of Russiagate is before we get into the actual story? What was the official narrative going around? What is Russiagate?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, it's a great point that it's important to talk about this again now, and especially about how quickly time flies there. I have a friend who's a college professor who told me he was going off about Russiagate, and he looked at the students and he realized they're just staring at him. They have no idea what he's talking about because they were 9, because that was 8 years ago. It's half their life ago, you know? So what happened was, essentially, the official story was that Russia heavily intervened in the election of 2016 with the cooperation of officials inside the Trump campaign to rig the election and steal it from Hilary Clinton and usurp her rightful throne as president by cheating. And they did this supposedly by hacking into the DNC and leaking a bunch of emails, and hacking into the Clinton campaign and leaking a bunch more, and supposedly intervening with some important number of Facebook ads and tweets by bots that supposedly would influence the American people to vote for Trump over Hillary. And then they kept the whole thing going for 3 years. And there was this endless deluge of stories, you know, like, I don't know, what, 25, 30, 45, you know, major claims and maybe 100 smaller ones of just, you know, essentially Russia being behind everything. It was like the second Red Scare, the first one, whatever. It was like a Red Scare. The Russians are coming. There's a commie under your bed and this kind of thing. And it was just completely nuts. And like, I don't mean to be too sexist about it, but like, it was a bunch of idiot, liberal, Democrat, white women who don't know anything about stuff, but liked essentially joining in with this big conspiracy theory that, you know, as Max Boot put it, not that he's a woman, but you understand, he goes, here's 17 reasons why Trump might be a Russian agent. That's the same thing they did with, here's 17 or 170 reasons why Saddam Hussein might be working with Osama bin Laden. And you see, the thing is, it's all lies. So it's 0 times 17. And what do you have at the end of that? Nothing. Same thing with the lies about Iraq. But it's enough to weave a web of conspiracy. Look, if all of these different things are true, then it sort of kind of makes sense that this was the thing that was going on. you begin to see the mosaic or the full picture of the thing, but it's all made up. So you're painting a mosaic in your imagination based on things, none of which are true. So it's a foundation of nonsense. But the thing is about nonsense is that just means you got to believe it harder because you don't really have any good facts. And so it becomes a real cult. Just like, during COVID, there's a long time there where wearing a mask, and, I live in Austin, Texas, so I can just tell you, I'm the authoritative source on this. I've seen it with my own eyes. I'm sure you all have too, everywhere you live. People wore masks just to signify that they weren't Trump voters, right? That was what the mask meant. It was the Trump people who were taking their masks off, which meant that you ain't taking your mask off if you're definitely one of these anti-Trump liberal Democrats and you want to make sure that everybody knows you are. You keep the mask on for an extra year to show to everyone that you're not a Republican, right? You could just get a Democratic Party t-shirt or something, you would think, but no. So, it's the same kind of thing. If you're starting to doubt, maybe you just need to believe harder, right? And then, so it became, and then there's a very much like in-group, out-group thing where all of us know what this horrible role that Russia played in foisting this guy on us and how everything would have been so much better and good and the way it was supposed to be if he hadn't. And, it was this terrible, intervention. And of course, so that's all a bunch of crap. What's really going on here, right, is that the CIA and the FBI were essentially enacting a color-coded type revolution against their own elected, major nominee for president, and then their own president. They were playing the same kind of dirty tricks they do to everybody else. And then whether the American public really knows anything about it or not, it's surely smacked of like this guilty conscience, projecting. Like, how dare these foreigners intervene in our election? Like, you've got to be kidding. Really? Oh, you're not kidding? Like, first of all, this isn't even true. But second of all, that's all America ever does is intervene in other countries' elections all day, every day. That's what USA stands for. We intervene in your elections, right? Like, that's the whole point is of being America, is making sure that the guy that our government wants to win wins in some foreign country. Otherwise, why else did Franklin Roosevelt found this country anyway? That's what this whole thing is supposed to be about, they think. And so then when it comes to the United States, they panic and they go, oh my God, can you believe that there's this nefarious intervention by this foreign power? But then, so here's the truth. The truth is that John Brennan made it up. He was the head of the CIA. And at the end of 2015, he went and, I forgot what the official name for it is, but he requested that the so-called Five Eyes, meaning the Anglophone countries, right, the Anglosphere countries, see what they can do to bump into Trump associates and see if you can find something Russian on them. And this is clearly the origin of the frame-up of a guy named George Papadopoulos, who was a low-level functionary for the Trump team and was trying to move up in the world and belonged to this think tank in Russia. And they sent him to Rome, where he happened to bump into this Australian ambassador who later claimed, clearly lying, that Papadopoulos had told him that he had, I'm sorry, I skipped a step. Forgive me. I'm getting carried away. They sent him to Rome to meet with a British spy who is a Maltese guy, but an MI6 agent named Misfood. And then they had him meet with, like a bump into this Australian diplomat named Downer. And then Downer turned around and said that, yeah, Papadopoulos told me that this Russian spy, Misfood, had told him that they had Hilary Clinton's emails and they were going to release them. And this is completely a hoax. It's not true. First of all, that was even true, but it was not true that Misfood was a Russian agent of any kind. He was MI6, right? And he had to go into hiding so he wouldn't have to explain the discrepancy here between who he was working for. And then it's Papadopoulos's denials are absolutely believable that he said any such thing to Downer, because Misfoot hadn't said any such thing to him, which Misfoot also says is the case. That he had never said anything such thing to the guy about it. And that if they were talking about emails, Hillary's emails at all, it had nothing to do with an upcoming leak from the DNC. It was the ongoing scandal at the time about Hillary Clinton having her own private email server at her house, which would have and could have and surely was hacked. She had her account on her phone when she's walking around inside Russia and inside China. Obviously, they're hacking that and getting back into this private server, which is obviously suspicious. She's running this foundation while she's out of power, preparing to be president, obviously laundering millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars coming in from foreign donors of all kinds. And she's got a private email server about it. So the question was, there's 30,000 missing emails. And is any of that going to come forward? Whatever. So that was just a topic in the news. They discussed emails at all. That was all they discussed. And later, these people, clearly as a favor to the intelligence agencies in the United States, to John Brennan, just kind of retconned this to try to make it fit when there was a leak of emails from the DNC and from Clinton's campaign manager, Podesta, John Podesta's email account. And they went, oh, this must have been what Papadopoulos was talking about. And it's interesting because there's so many different things here, but
just to jump in, can you just tell people who Papadopoulos is just within the Trump realm?
He was, like I say, he was like a low-level think tank type who was trying to move up in the world and got this job on the Trump campaign. But he was an amateur, basically. I don't want to sell him too short. He was some kind of expert on Mediterranean petroleum reserves or natural gas reserves and this kind of thing. So he was some kind of consultant. And he was basically, his job was, and we know exactly what his job was. There's nothing secret about it. It was all about arranging meetings with foreign leaders for the Trump campaign. Like, for example, with Egyptian President Fattah al-Sisi, El Presidente, dictator, Generalissimo al-Sisi, and things like that. And his attempts to arrange a meeting between Trump and Putin were all completely above board. There's nothing secret about that. And it wasn't operating on any kind of back channel or any kind of thing. It was to create a public, a public relations thing, which just goes to show what an amateur he was, right? And it was senior officials on the Trump campaign team that told him, no, pipe down. We're not meeting with Putin before the election. That's bad politics. That looks terrible. We don't want to do that. We want to get along with Russia, but we don't like them that much that, you know what I mean? We're doing a state visit with him before we're even elected, this kind of thing. So, so that was who he was, and that was the context, but he was somebody that was just connected at all. And then the FBI used this as their original predicate to investigate Trump, even though they very quickly abandoned it because I guess they were afraid to go to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court with a straight face on this story, when I guess maybe they would have had to try to show why they believed that Misfoot was a Russian spy rather than a British one, and they didn't want to do that. I'm not exactly sure, but they quickly dropped him and replaced him with accusations against a guy named Carter Page, who was another low-level functionary on the Trump campaign, would-be foreign policy advisor that had come to volunteer and work with the campaign. And the thing is about him was he was a oil company consultant, and he would go to Russia all the time, and he would meet with Russian government officials and businessmen of various kinds over the years. And he would always meet with his CIA handlers and debrief them about everything that he did. He was an American patriot and a loyal CIA asset. He wasn't going to go around. I mean, and just think about it. If for whatever reason, you're trying to be in the oil consultant business in Russia, but you are an American citizen. Let's say you're not an American patriot. You still better cover your ass by meeting with your local CIA handler and telling him everything that you heard and learned while you were over there, assuming you're not up to anything that's going to get you in much trouble. You better make sure that they know that you're not up to anything that's going to get you in much trouble, right? So Carter Page has an open, friendly, ongoing relationship with CIA. who don't doubt him at all, who don't think he's any kind of spy at all. And they told the FBI that, oh, Carter Page, no, he works for us. But then you know what the FBI did? An agent named Kevin Kleinsmith was convicted of this. So I know it's an absolute fact. He pleaded guilty and was let off with a slap on the wrist, but still was a felony. He lied to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and he made a copy of the CIA memo to the FBI, and he put a piece of paper and redacted that part and made the copy and took the part where they said, oh, no, Page, he's a friend of ours. He works for us. It's all good. And took that out of their application for a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrant to search the Trump campaign. So now the Fourth Amendment, you might be familiar with it. It says they can't search your stuff unless they're investigating a crime. They can't be investigating you. They have to be investigating a crime, and they have to persuade the judge that there's probable cause, meaning a better than half chance you think, or you can show or make the judge agree that he also believes that there's a better chance than not that you're going to find evidence of the crime if you go and search some property. And as the Fourth Amendment says, the warrant has to be, first of all, a judicial warrant from a separate branch of government, and it must be particularly describing the places or things to be searched and seized, right? But that's not the law. If you're a foreign agent, then all the FBI has to do is tell the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that we have a reason to believe that this guy's an agent of a foreign power or a foreign terrorist group. That's it. We don't have to think he's up to anything wrong at all. But he's a foreign agent of a foreign state in our country, or a foreign terrorist group in our country. Then that's all we have to do is demonstrate that we have a reason to believe that. Just a reason to believe it, not a probable cause to believe it. A reason to believe it. Reasonable belief. And then search all their stuff. And this is what they're doing to the Trump campaign. They're getting a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrant with this lowest threshold, as though they're hunting a bin Ladenite, or as though they're hunting an agent of a literal agent of Moscow in the country. They're doing this to the major party nominee for president of the United States of America. And they're doing, now once they start tapping, now they can do 2 hops. But 2 hops is everything. And maybe they can go 4 hops, whatever it is. So hops means that anybody you call, now they can tap anybody they call and anybody they call. Well, that's a lot of hops already, even if it's just 2, right? You see how far it goes right away. So if that means if you can tap Carter Page, then you can tap the whole campaign. Everybody's called somebody on that chain in there easily, right? And you can just go to the one that Carter Page called, who's the most connected to everyone else, and use him as the hop. And then you get to tap the entire campaign. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, just to rewind for people, because they've probably heard of things like, I know these characters are important and you may be going in a certain order, but we have, Christopher Steele, the MI6 agent. Everyone's kind of maybe heard of the Steele dossier. And then, you talk about who the actual Russiagate, framers was the FBI, the CIA, also the Hilary Clinton campaign themselves, right? It goes back to that. They hired, was it the law firm Perkins and Co. or something like that, who hired, to do up this research, and Christopher Steele, etc. Can you just, before I guess we go on, just cover the bit about the fact that, they're framing Trump, who's against Hillary Clinton, right? Or at the start of his presidency as well, after. And it's cooked up by the opposition. If that was another country, people would be laughing about all that corruption. So can you just tell people about that link directly to Hillary Clinton, and obviously also some of the information you're saying, just so people know, came out in later investigations like the Durham report, etc., which we can get to. But just so people are wondering, like, where is he plucking all this information from? It's from the investigations after, reports you can read, put in the show notes. But yeah, if you could just tell people about the Hillary Clinton connection and everything there.
Sure. And as you said in the beginning there, I have 75 pages on this in my book, Provoked, where I take you through every single accusation that I could think of or find anywhere or remember. I know I missed a few, but I go through and I steel man the other side of the story as best as I can, and then show why they're totally wrong. So that's all in Provoked. And I have all citations for every claim that I make. And including, as you say, government investigations in the aftermath of the thing. So, but you're right. there's multiple parts of this. It starts with the CIA having their foreign friends frame up this American, right? So I jumped ahead to page because I wanted to talk about how they only went so far with Papadopoulos, showing that not just they knew that they were lying, but they knew that their lies were so tissue paper thin that they were never going to be able to justify an investigation of the Trump campaign based on just Papadopoulos. So they dropped that. They brought him up later in the news to try to make you think, oh, wow, a new important thing. Nuh-uh. They had already dismissed his importance and didn't even try to bring his case before the FISA court. But now to rewind in the timeline of the origin of the thing, we're still talking about the spring. It all began at the very, very end of 15. And we're talking about the early part of 2016 here, right? The campaign year. And so the FBI is already getting in on the act on these CIA referrals, basically, and referrals that they're getting from these foreigners. And at what point the Clinton campaign becomes aware of all this, I don't know. I mean, John Brennan and Hilary Clinton might have cooked this up over a game of croquet or whatever. I don't know exactly where the campaign's team got in on it. But they clearly knew that this was going on. Hell, give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they thought, oh my goodness, there's smoke. Maybe there's fire. And then they thought, hey, maybe we can help make more smoke. So what they did then was they hired this law firm, as you said. It's called Perkins Coie, I think, because somebody heard that said out loud somewhere and corrected me. But it's COIE. And that law firm then was sort of the hub of the spoke of a lot of the Russiagate stuff. This is where a bunch of the noise came from. So they were the ones who hired the Georgia Tech team of researchers, as well as the computer security team that both worked together to claim that it was the Russians who had hacked into the DNC and had fished the Podesta emails and given them all to WikiLeaks. And they were the same group that had the Georgia Tech team come up with this DNA traffic, suspicious DNA traffic, DNS traffic, supposedly around Trump Tower connected to Russia, which that didn't get much play. That was only reported to the FBI and didn't get out into the media that much. I don't think it did at all until later. But it was something that they were part of this plot was the Clinton campaign. They were coming up with this stuff to get the FBI to investigate it. And they didn't care whether it panned out or not. They were trying to trigger official FBI processes, because then that's the news story, is that, oh my God, the FBI is looking into Russian involvement with Trump, right? So it's all about creating the noise there. Another one was the Yada phones. This is a kind of Russian smartphone. And they were saying, oh, see, we have the computer results say that there were all these suspicious Yada phones near Trump Tower in New York, which is another hoax. They're desperately trying to make this stuff look like something. Another one was the Alpha Bank. And this is still, again, the Georgia Tech team that's coming up with this stuff. And in this claim, and this got published in Slate and got repeated everywhere, and Franklin Foer somehow still has a career, but the claim was that Trump's campaign or Trump Tower has a secret server that's secretly communicating with the KGB or the FSB somehow, or military intelligence in Russia, by way of the Alpha Bank. And that the Alpha Bank is acting as a cutout for Russian intelligence and controlling Trump through this secret server. And it turned out, it was just a Trump hotel spam bot that was like making the whole world suffer their, garbage. And Alpha Bank was getting Trump hotel spam, just like however many other people, had nothing to do with anything at all. And of course, it turned out later, it was funny that Putin said he was trying to get in contact. Not just he reported this story later, but the story was reported that Putin had, and I think this was in one of the government reports, that Putin asked the head of the Alpha Bank, do you know how to get a hold of Trump? And he's like, nah, this is all made up, right? And then of course the big one was Perkins Coie, whatever. They hired the firm that did the so-called opposition research that was ultimately became known as the Steele dossier. And the Steele dossier then came with a ton of accusations in there, including that Putin had taken control of Trump 5 years before and had fully, taken control of him as a spy, an asset, and a Manchurian candidate, and was using his campaign manager, Paul Manafort, and this guy, Carter Page, his foreign policy advisor, as agents to control Trump. And that Jeff Sessions, the longtime Republican senator from Alabama who had got on the Trump train, early on, that he was compromised by the Russians, that Mike Flynn, who had been the, head of intelligence in the Iraq and Afghan wars for the Joint Special Operations Command in Iraq, and then for the whole war in Afghanistan, and then had been the 3-star general commander of the Defense Intelligence Agency under Obama before he got fired, that he was a Russian spy, and that, he had been compromised in all these ways. And I'm trying to remember what I'm leaving out. There's important stuff in the Steele dossier. Anyway, all of it was fake. And they would go, well, certain major parts of the Steele dossier have been confirmed. Yeah, the parts that were open source before he wrote it. So Carter Page went to Russia. He found that somewhere. And then he just made up that, yeah, while Carter Page was there, he had a top secret meeting. My sources tell me he had a top secret meeting with this and that powerful banker and this and that powerful member of Russia's National Security Council. Like, no, he didn't. He just made that part up. And then they go, well, major parts of it have been confirmed. Carter Page has been to Russia before. Oh, okay. Yeah. And then it was all like that. And we know now, of course, that the FBI had made a big spreadsheet, as you think they might, with a series of accusations like this. They did a big spreadsheet where they figured out that the only things true in the Steele dossier were things that were openly reported before it was written. And everything that was in the Steele dossier that was an assertion of fact that had not been reported turned out to not be true and never substantiated in any other way. And one of their claims about Page was that he was going to take this massive commission that would have been worth like $50 million or something if he had arranged the sale of this major Russian gas giant between different Russian nationals and government officials and stuff. And they were going to do this to him just as a payoff for his secret control of Donald Trump, even though and specifically because he was going to take control of American sanctions policy and get all sanctions on Russia lifted. Even though if this guy had made it, if none of this would have happened, then he would have been at most like the deputy national security advisor, probably not even that. He would have had a lower position on the National Security Council. He certainly would not be able to dictate to Lindsey Graham in the Senate that we're lifting all sanctions on Russia now, right? Or anything like that. The whole thing was completely absurd. And then of course, and the major part of it also was that Trump was blackmailed because the Russians had secret footage from a hotel room where he had hired prostitutes to urinate on a bed where Barack and Michelle Obama had slept. Now, this is just absolutely the most ridiculous thing in the entire world. But the liberals, they love to believe in it so much. And Stephen Colbert went to that hotel and looked at the thing or whatever. But there was no source for this. The whole thing was bogus. And it turned out that Steele's two primary sources were a Russian national named Danchenko, who had been investigated by the FBI for being a Russian agent, and they had only closed that investigation because they mistakenly believed that he had left the country, not because they were satisfied that he was not a Russian spy, and a guy named Christopher Dolan. Definitely Dolan. And Dolan was an American, but he was a registered agent of Russia, or had been in the past. Had been a lobbyist for the Russian government, officially, and registered as such. And these were the guys who were essentially, as they put it, just BSing over beers, coming up with stuff, just making up stuff that they could put in this thing. And it's, what they call opposition research, but it's just a hatchet job, right? A smear job. But then the FBI relied on this to get their FISA warrant. They took this absolute absurdity. I mean, the day that BuzzFeed finally posted the Steele dossier online, I took one look at it and I saw the proposed deal with Carter Page, how he was supposed to make like these hundreds of millions of dollars off of this commission for this oil trade. And I said, this whole thing is obviously a hoax. That is absolutely absurd. That is not, and I'm no oil businessman, but I know that's not how it works. You know, in fact, there was a scandal where this high society lady down in Florida was screwing all these generals down at Central Command down there in Tampa. And, you know, including, what's his name? The old Marine general, not Mattis, before him. Dunford? Was it General Dunford? And anyway, she was essentially like, this lady was this like extremely pushy social climber who was trying very hard to make herself extremely important in top military type social circles in Tampa. And that one of the ways that she had overplayed her hand was she had helped introduce a couple of people on an oil deal where anyone who's anyone in the oil business knows that the standard deal is a flat $1 million. You don't get a percentage. And she was demanding like this huge amount of money for their new deal and whatever. And they were just going, no, that's not how you do it, you know? So the idea, the Russians are going to give Carter Page hundreds of millions of dollars, this most blatant thing that there's no way in the world you could hide from the FBI and the CIA in a million years. And somehow, you know, Donald Trump's handler, because everybody knows how easy it is to tell Donald Trump what to do. You know what I mean? Like the whole thing was so stupid. And also the accusations against Paul Manafort. Now, the idea there was Paul Manafort had been a campaign advisor to Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine. Get it? Yanukovych, pro-Russia. Therefore, just turn your brain off and now believe that Vladimir Putin is using Manafort to control Trump the same way he used Manafort to control Yanukovych. Except that's not the history of his relationship with Yanukovych at all. Manafort was there to move Ukraine west. He was there to move Ukraine away from Russia. And that was at a time that America wasn't as badly at odds with Russia as we were after 2014 anyway. This was during the era of Bush looking into Putin's soul and Barack Obama seeking a reset after the disaster of Bucharest and the Georgia War of '08 and all of that. And so what he was doing was contrary to Russia's interests, but even if they had been, you know, essentially copacetic or, you know, congruent with Russian interests, that wouldn't not necessarily have been treason, except in the craziest of retrospect, the most dishonest of retrospect anyway. But his whole thing was helping Yanukovych win and then helping him move west. And the first thing he did was take him to Brussels, not Moscow, as soon as he won. And he was the one advising him to sign the association deal with the EU, not advising him to break it on behalf of secret orders from Moscow or any of that, right? You just have to not know any of this stuff and not want to know the details if you want to believe that Manafort was a Russian agent of any kind in Ukraine or in the United States. It's a complete hoax. And I urge people to watch his interview with Patrick Bet-David, where he goes over all this. And he's obviously sincere. He's clearly a pro-Ukraine partisan and you know, demonizes Putin and whatever demonizes, I don't know. He clearly takes Ukraine's side against Russia in this thing. No question that and you look at his cufflinks and everything, I'd be surprised the guy's not CIA. He seems like the type of guy who at least has dinner with CIA guys and they like each other. There's no way in the world. Like, you have to just want to believe that this guy was acting against the interests of the United States of America and Ukraine. He had no reason to do so. Not for money, but first of all, that wasn't what he was doing or the agenda going on at the time. But it would make no sense for him to put himself in the crosshairs of the United States in that way when he's an American and he can make plenty of money not getting himself thrown in prison. You know, the whole thing is crazy. And so the idea then that he's Trump's secret handler too? No, Trump just picked him because he's, you know, he's Roger Stone's friend. He had a thing, you know, with Trump's friend Stone where they get people elected. That's their specialty, is they're political consultants for national elections all over the world, and including for some pretty bad strongmen around the world. I'm not saying they got the most savory reputation, but it ain't treason to support American-supported dictators in other countries or, you know, autocrats in other countries, which is essentially Stone and Manafort's business that they had been in for a long time. So
So you've just kind of laid out a lot of different figures, and I know the mainstream media like to call everyone conspiracy theorists with that. This was a crazy conspiracy theory in the mainstream, as you've described, about Trump and figures around him during the campaign, that he's a Russian agent surrounded by Russian spies trying to influence his campaign, but it's actually the FBI, the CIA, and the Hillary Clinton campaign gunning for him. And lots of this comes out in the Durham report, like where you talk about the FBI covering up that Carter was a CIA asset so they would get their warrant. But before the Durham report, where it's fully exposed, we have the Mueller report. So what's the Mueller report, and who is he as well?
So this goes to, in the story, what happened was they failed to keep him out. They did announce that there were investigations going on and so forth. They failed to frame him well enough to keep him from beating Hillary in the election. Then they decided essentially to double down. And they released this intelligence report just before he was inaugurated, 3 days before he was inaugurated, making all these claims. In fact, not making very many specific claims, but just saying that Russia had influenced the election so severely, and essentially, poisoning the whole relationship with him, and then letting him know that there's a Steele report going around claiming that he's cavorting with prostitutes and stuff. And then that warning, quote unquote, wink nudge warning by the FBI director Comey is actually the hook for publishing it. And he's the one who leaked it. To like, Comey briefs president on rumors. And then that becomes the fact that you can report, right? And then they published the Steele dossier. And so the media just went completely crazy with this stuff. And just 6-8 weeks later, Trump fires Comey. At that point, the Justice Department opens up a new investigation into Trump to see whether Russia had Trump fire Comey. Like, he didn't have the most obvious cause in the world to do so. And then they launched the special counsel investigation. Now, they, at the time, for real, were plotting to use this excuse to overthrow him, to invoke the 25th Amendment, which is for in case Woodrow Wilson has a stroke or Joe Biden has dementia, you have his cabinet throw him out of power because he is incompetent. He's unable, literally, to execute his office. But they want to just do it with Trump because the Russians stole it for him. And he's an illegitimate president. On that basis, they wanted to overthrow him. And his own Justice Department, the Department of Justice, they talked about it. They were going to do whatever they could. They were going to wear a wire in the White House, try to do anything they could to try to catch him on a felony, and then try to get his own cabinet to vote to remove him from power. It's completely bananas. And when they decided that they couldn't do that, and in fact, I know I sound crazy when I say it because that's how crazy it is, but no, that's the real history. And then when they decided they can't do that, they told CNN, well, at least we can still rein him in. And we can use this permanent new special counsel investigation into him in order to prevent him from having his own independent foreign policy, particularly on Russia. We could prevent him from undoing the Obama-Biden status quo on America's Cold War with Russia. And so, so they did. So Robert Mueller then is the guy who wrote the report you're referring to. He investigated for another 2 years. And it wasn't until the late spring of 2019, after, it had already been almost a year of this stuff by the time they started. So it's like 3 years straight of this breathless conspiracy theorizing over Trump and Russia. And to the bitter end, the media and the Democrats especially, but the leadership of the Republican Party too, they're all in on this narrative. Geez, the intelligence agencies say so. So all respectable Republicans know that it has to be right. And so this is the consensus. The conspiracy theory was the consensus for 3 years. And we're just waiting for the other shoe to drop, even though there never was a first one. We're waiting for the smoke to turn into fire. We're waiting for all the accusations. We're waiting for the magic key to turn that'll make all of these things to be proven true in the end. We're waiting. Meanwhile, you might suspect that, like, well, wait a minute. I mean, if the CIA and the FBI really think that there is a traitor sitting behind the Resolute desk, then we should be holding impeachment hearings and we should be having a Senate trial to remove this man from power. What do you mean we're going to wait for 2 years for you guys to screw around and find out if this is true or not? The FBI and the CIA and the NSA, they can prove if this is true. If it's true, it's provable. And if they can't prove it, then they better put up or shut up. But instead, no. We got 2 years. The entire first 2 years of his presidency is taken up with people wondering all day long. Just wondering, waiting. We know this and we know that, they would say wrongly, but just waiting to find out whether the president of the United States was guilty of the highest treason in the history of the world or not. Whether he made Benedict Arnold look like George Washington or whether he was just plain old Donald Trump, the same Donald Trump that he's always been. And for years this went on, which to me it's the most outrageous thing. To me, it's no different than if they'd shot him in the face in Dallas or, you know, the Waco massacre or any of like the worst FBI outrages. Like, how dare they do this? And I'm not the greatest fan of whatever political system, but he stood for election and won. Who in the hell are they? Who do they think they are to take on the major party presidential candidate in the first place? Much less double down after he wins. You know, I skipped the part there where they wanted to have the Hillary Clinton campaign was absolutely behind this. I have like 16 footnotes for this one claim because I want to just rub your face in it. That this is a proven fact. You think I'm crazy? Nuh-uh. Debunk this. Here's in their own words. They wanted to get Michael Morrell, the acting director of the CIA, to brief the Electoral College that Russia had stolen the election from Hillary Clinton and they should give it to her. And if not, then they should at least make it a tie or by some vote to kick it to the House of Representatives so that the House of Representatives can give it to Paul Ryan or Colin Powell or John Kasich instead of Trump. They wanted to do that. And of course, the reality is the electors in the Electoral College, they come from the parties out in the country. They're not all establishment Republicans from Georgetown. In other words, they're Trump guys. And there's no way in the world they were going to take that was going to work. But they were serious as hell about wanting to do that. Just like they were serious as hell about wanting to invoke the 25th Amendment to overthrow him out of power, as though he had had a stroke and was incapable of executing the duties of his office, as they put it. That was how crazy it was, based on total nothing, right? Like they would say about the .coms, vaporware. A program we promise we're going to write someday that's going to do all this magnificent stuff. It was all vaporware. It was all nothing the whole time. So then Mueller investigates it the whole time. And I have 75 pages in the book on this. There are all these accusations that like I don't even have time to bring up, much less debunk. Like the Michael Flynn stuff. I just mentioned his name, but like we don't even have time to discuss exactly what it was there. But there was 1,000 of them. And they just kept lying and lying and lying and lying. And then the Mueller report finally came out in May, I guess, of 2019. And what it says for the whole first half of it is, yeah, we got nothing. Sorry. There's nothing there. And the whole second half of it was, Trump may have tried to obstruct justice. Because, yeah, they had the courage to go ahead and also launch a separate investigation into him to see whether he was obstructing justice. But what justice? What are you talking about? Obstructing injustice. He's a sitting United States president. They're framing him for treason with the Kremlin. And they're taking statements where he's blowing off steam going, geez, I wish I could somehow make this stop. And asking like the head of the Office of Special Counsel, the Office of Legal Counsel in the White House. Is there anything you can do to like make them stop or something? And then he's like, no, Mr. President. And then like, that might be obstruction of justice. They had nothing. And the whole first half of the thing was just admission after admission after admission. They had nothing. And they didn't even have a chain of custody to WikiLeaks for the DNC and the Podesta hack. They didn't even try to prove it. They had no idea how WikiLeaks got their hands on that leak. They had no proof whatsoever that the Russians had did it. They had no proof whatsoever that Fancy Bear did it. And they admit they had no proof that Fancy Bear was the Russians. It was only an inference based on speculation, based on their opinion, based on this previous case where they had also inferred that maybe it was the Russians. That was all they had, turtles all the way down, just nothing but nonsense the whole way through. And
what was the media's role in this? Because obviously, we've heard about the FBI, the CIA, their manipulation, but how much of this, living through this in America was a media game?
Oh, it was huge, of course. I mean, they were all recruited into the thing. Some of them explicitly, like Rachel Maddow was like, clearly had made an agreement that I promised to push this narrative. You didn't lose, they stole it. And then the rest of the media, they just loved it. They wanted to believe. I mean, they had all been so repudiated. I mean, first of all, too, they had this caricature of Donald Trump was what they thought they had lost to, right? So like you have people who, one, they talk themselves into believing that this guy is a Nazi fascist Führer, dictator, who's going to round up all the non-whites in America and execute them and dump their bodies in the Gulf of America or whatever. And then the American people elected him. But I believe in the American people. They're not that evil. They wouldn't do that. But the thing is, no, he wouldn't do that. These liberals are just stupid, right? So then they got to rationalize, how could this guy have won when he's the Nazi fascist monster of my dreams? So then it must be that a foreign power intervened. And after all, it's the FBI and the CIA saying it's true. And so, and especially think of the psychology there, where he's the president, but the government's essentially refusing to let him take control of it because they know that he's a traitor. So if you're a liberal Democrat and you see the CIA and the FBI going that far, that they're working that hard against the guy when he's still sitting in the chair, he was sworn in, and they're still going that hard against him, well, you think that's for nothing? And that was the thing about it. In fact, we talked about what a conspiracy theory this was. Well, they turned it around and they said, well, man, you're the conspiracy theorist. What do you think? That the FBI and the CIA and the Democrats and the media are all working together to make this seem true? I mean, that's crazy. You're the kook for saying that it's a lie, because there's an affirmative truth there that all these people are lying. There's the thing. It's not just a lack of evidence against Trump, but these people keep saying there is some. So that makes them all in on this thing. And it's pretty grandiose. And you might sound like a kook for identifying it for what it was. But it was a far less grandiose conspiracy theory than theirs, and ultimately proved absolutely to be true. That every bit of this just comes from the FBI, the CIA, and the Clinton campaign. None of it was true. None of it.
We've only got about 5 minutes or so left, but how much of this had an effect on Trump's foreign policy with Russia, this relationship? Because the reason I thought it would be a good time to have you on now is obviously the Ukraine-Russia talks are going on. A lot of this old theory comes back out. He's a Russian agent. He's throwing Ukraine under the bus. And there's still just a lot of people in the UK media who, I don't know if they've looked into the Durham report, etc., and they just still think Trump must be some sort of Russian spy, and he wants close relations with Russia. So
I'm glad you mentioned the Durham report. I mean, it's so important. People should read. The Mueller report can be summed up as we got nothing, right? The Durham report was actually the investigation into the investigation and how it all started, and it's great. And man, and we know now that the Justice Department forced him to stop early, and that he could have gone much further. But still, for what it is, I urge people to read it. It is flabbergasting. Like, wow. And essentially what it is it's the story of all the things the FBI pretended to not know while they kept investigating this case. That's how it could be summed up. Oh, boy, were they lying. Wow, what impressive liars. And the Hillary campaign role and all that as well. It really is. You will gain insight into how the U.S. government operates reading that Durham report. It is really something. And I'm not saying it's the end all of everything, but only because it's worse than that, I'm sure, but that ought to be bad enough for you. It really is amazing. It's like Yeah, everybody knows the CIA killed Jack Kennedy or what. Yeah, everybody knows the CIA framed Donald Trump for treason with the Kremlin in Moscow, Russia, because of course, that's the way business is done. It really is absurd and astounding and impressive and important. I think, I really highly urge people to read that. I mean, read Provoked first, but by all means. In fact, I had so much work done on this, and then the Durham report came out. And so many of my paragraphs then got superseded by Durham report stuff where I already got it right. But then he has the facts. So, you know what I mean? Like I already figured it out, but then he can make the absolute assertion from authority that this is exactly what happened according to his internal investigation. So I ended up replacing a lot of great work, which is, citing him bothers me. But anyway, and then what effect did it have on Trump and his foreign policy? Everything, because he essentially, and as was meant to happen and was predictable enough, and he couldn't resist it. He had to do anti-Russia things to prove he wasn't a Russian puppet. And so when he bombed Syria, his son said, oh, yeah, well, if we're Russian puppets, how come we're bombing Syria? That was, I think, the most overt statement like that. But you would have, quotations kind of off the record and the overall, reporting in the Post and the Times and the Journal would say, under pressure over his alleged ties to Russia, the White House, feels like they got to do this and that. And that included, of course, continuing the war in Ukraine, which he could have stopped immediately in 2016. The talks that he's having right now, trying to end the war, he could have ended what was already an ongoing civil war with a looming threat of a Russian invasion back 8 years ago. Just dial your time machine back to right then. No Russiagate hoax. We could have been having those talks right then and settling this issue without any loss of Ukrainian territory to Russia whatsoever. The deal was to come in and implement the Minsk II peace deal. If they'd been able to do that and forswear NATO membership and all this stuff, they could have ended all of this back then. And they couldn't. I'm old enough to remember when the Supreme Court decided we're halting the recount and W. Bush is going to be the president-elect now. Which, by the way, and I'm no Al Gore partisan, believe me, but he did win Florida. On the final recount later, it turned out that, actually, no, it was the Democrats who won. But the Supreme Court stopped it when they stopped it. And when they did, it was like a magic spell or like a hypnosis where every lady on TV news said, President-elect George W. Bush today, blah, 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 blah. He's our great leader, and we all respect his authority, and we all respect the legitimacy of the process that made him our president-elect right now. There was no more question about it. The Supreme Court has ruled, that's it. Not just on Fox News, but on MSNBC and CNN and ABC and CBS and NBC too. George W. Bush is the president-elect. Boy, once he's sworn in a few weeks from now, his word will be the law of the universe. We sure are all agreed about that. They gave him total legitimacy. Donald Trump got none. And so if they had not done this to him, the counterfactual is the entire current war would have been prevented. It would have never happened. And it's an absolute crime against the people of Ukraine, for one, of what they did to him then, to hem him in. And then, but once they did, he then, in their words, reined him in. What he did was he increased arms sales, and you'll hear him bragging now. All Obama did was send sheets and blankets. I'm the one who sent the Javelin missiles. And I'm the one who worked so hard to prevent Germany and Russia from completing the Nord Stream project and all of this stuff. But why was he working so hard against Russian interests during that time? When he said he wanted to get along with Russia, a huge part of it was to prove that he wasn't a Russian agent. And even things like preventing Nord Stream, because he really wants Germany to not be that dependent on Russian gas, and he wants them to be dependent on Texan gas instead, and all of this stuff. Still, that could have been worked out possibly, or at least fought about in a much better environment, right? In a spirit of cooperation, at least on some level, rather than the whole thing being essentially proof. Being engineered to prove that Russiagate's not true, because look at how hard I'm being on them. And so then after 4 years in power, when he left, the Civil War was still going on. He'd taken no real steps to end it whatsoever. And I don't know if he knows this or not, but his ambassador, William Taylor, deliberately sabotaged a German peace plan called the Steinmeier Formula in 2019, right after Zelensky was elected, to try to come up with a new order of operations for implementing Minsk II. And Trump's ambassador told him, don't do this, and helped encourage him to throw it in the trash, just like Warren Zimmerman helping trash the Lisbon deal of 1992 that could have prevented the war in Bosnia. And I don't know if Trump knows that or not, but his government helped to squash that. When what should they have been doing in 2019? Oh, we have a brand new president and he's Jewish, which means he's not ethnically Ukrainian and he's not ethnically Russian. And he's a Russian speaker, but he's from Kharkiv, not the Donbass. So like there's a compromise, and he wants peace, and he's elected with support in the west of the country too, to a great degree. He completely trounced his predecessor in the election. So, and he ran on peace. He had a mandate for peace. All he needed was a little support from the United States at that time, but Trump wasn't willing to give it to him because he was too compromised. And in fact, it would have been a great victory lap after the failure of Mueller in the spring of 19. Now here in the early fall of 19, it would have been great to start doing the right thing then, but nope. And so, yeah, the counterfactual is none of this had to happen in terms of American policy with Russia, and Russiagate clearly helped to absolutely poison the mind. Even after it all fell apart, it doesn't matter that it all fell apart. They still essentially the Democrats still feel the same way about Russia as Russiagate made them feel. And it was a huge part of why the Biden regime and his entire chorus of yes men and whatever could not even fathom figuring out a compromise solution to the situation in Ukraine in 2021. This was the Russia of Russiagate, who had just waged this massive operation against our country. And now we're going to let them get away. We're going to appease them in Ukraine. No way. And so that made the Democrats that much harder of heart and unreasonable to deal with, and help lead to the war. No question about it.
Yeah, and absolutely. It's going to have an effect going forward with the new Cold War with Russia. Hopefully that will simmer down under Trump. We'll have to see what happens with these negotiations in Ukraine and beyond. But thanks for coming on again, Scott. Really appreciate it. I recommend everyone read your book. I'm getting through it at the moment. I skipped through to Russiagate because I thought everything going on at the moment, it's good to get a proper insight into that. But I recommend the book in whole and the Durham report and everything around. It's fascinating reading it, hearing the FBI agents and even British agents going, is this it? Like, is this all the information they've got? It doesn't make any sense. Like, I'm guessing they have more, because otherwise they wouldn't be asking us to read it. I'll put it all in the show notes. I'll put it up on the screen throughout. But yeah, thanks for coming on, Scott. And yeah, thanks for all your work.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.